This is session 4 of the Law Society 2016 Return to Work programme. Welcome to session 4 of our Return to Work programme. I'm Keith O'Malley of the Law Society Career Support Service. Hi. This programme has been organised to support solicitors who are in a return to work situation. In session 3, the last session, we covered easy ways to get a job. We looked at smart job seeking strategies. We looked at speculative approaches and how they might work best for people in a return to work situation. And we finished up by looking at social networking and how people in a return to work situation might choose that. In this session, we're going to look at successful interviewing with a particular focus on how a person in a return to work situation might handle themselves. We're going to look at competency interviews, sometimes called competency-based interviews, just in case you haven't covered them and you're not familiar with them. We're going to look at telephone interviews because these are something that quite often come up for people in a return to work situation. We're going to look at negotiating, and we're going to look at how you might propose an arrangement to an employer. So we're going to start with successful interviewing. It's important to say from the outset that this video isn't intended as a replacement or instead of the existing interview booklet and interview videos that we have available for people, for solicitors who are job seeking. And this booklet here, as you see on the screen, is something that if you haven't got a copy of, you're welcome to a copy. If you give us send us an email, give us a phone call, we'll send you a copy of this booklet. If you want to contact us about this booklet or about anything else, our telephone number, our direct dial number is 01 8815 766. There it is up on the screen. And also our email address is the simple one, the nice one is there up on the screen now, is careers@lawsociety.ie. So what we're going to do is look at some things that essentially are the fundamentals of good interviewing. And when an employer interviews, they tend to focus on three main things. They are keen to find out whether a person will fit in. They're keen to find out whether a person has, has the right attitude and sufficient energy and enthusiasm to do the job, and thirdly, will represent the firm if put in front of clients and that sort of thing. So when you go for interview, you try and focus on these and in all sorts of ways. So if you're asked a question about strengths, it's great to say, well, I get on well with people. That certainly will reflect somebody who's likely to fit in and get on with in a particular work environment. When you're interviewing, focus on the job that the employer is recruiting for and the level of the job. If it's a managerial job, they're going to have a certain focus on what they're looking for in terms of what the person can bring to the job. And you need to fashion your answers on that with regard to the job that you're being interviewed for. It's completely different interviewing for an assistant solicitor job as it is for a more senior role, and so you need to understand what the employer is looking for, and you need to fashion your answers in the way you handle yourself at the interview accordingly. Talk about the job in as much as you can. Richard Bowles and others say that this is the indication of how well you do at an interview. At the end of an interview, if you look at the amount of time that was spent on talking about the job and how it might be developed, as opposed to talking about your past and what you did in the past, and worse still, how Manchester United did on the weekend, that if you have spent a lot of time talking about the job, you're likely to have done well. So the extension of that obviously is that if you can turn discussion around in as far as possible to the job, you're going to do better. And how you do that is at the as you give an answer, you say, and of course this is relevant to this job, or it seems to me this is relevant to this job for the following reason, and try and tie in what you're saying to what you understand their needs are. Really, really important. Identify and address their priorities and their concerns. And a lot of this can be done before you go for interview and your interview preparation. You read up about the people, you find out, you talk to people who know them, and you get an understanding of what they're looking for. But sometimes at interview, as you go, as the interview progresses, and as you both talk about the job and what needs to be done, you'll get a sense so often about what is really important to them and what their concerns are. And you need, if you're smart, you'll take note of those, and you'll start appealing to them and focusing more on them than on other things that maybe you thought were more important. When you're in a situation of return to work, you'll very likely have particular priorities. You might want part-time work, you might want a more flexible working arrangement, something like that. And if you have a particular, something that you want, or it might be something that you believe you have to offer. If you have a number of years experience, you might feel that, you can work without much in the way of supervision and direction. And that's something that you feel that you have to offer over other people that they may see. But whatever you believe you need from the job in terms of flexibility, or in terms of working arrangements, or whatever you having looked at yourself, you believe that you're bringing, which is pretty unique to the marketplace, you need to stress those as you progress through the interview. And a good way of doing this is tag them on to answers. So you're talking about whatever, about how the job might be done and your understanding of the job. And if you're looking for shorter time or part-time working, you might say, it seems to me that this job could well be done in the following kind of arrangement, and start proposing what you're looking for. If you do that, be ready to explain and talk in terms that are very attractive to the employer. The whole thing about return to work so often is you're not going along like any other, or like a lot of other younger, more less experienced candidates. Quite often you're going along and you can't maybe work the same kind of hours as somebody who's just qualified and has no particular responsibilities or anything else like that. You need to work a set number of hours. You need to get away from work at a particular time every day, or whatever kind of arrangements you need. And what you need to do is to understand what you're looking for from a job, and then shape that and mold that into something that sounds attractive to an employer. So you need to shape what you're looking for, and to couch it in terms that an employer will find interesting. And this is really key at interview. And be ready to explain what you're talking about in detail, how it might work, and deal with any problems. Don't get caught out where an employer says, well, what if the following happens, how would we deal with that? Really try and be prepared for all questions that you might get asked. So we're now going to look at competency interviews. Competency interviews are sometimes called competency-based interviews, and sometimes called behavioural interviews, are interviews that have come up, have developed over the last 15, 20 years. And they're used by large organisations a lot, within the public sector, and large firms as well. But a lot of people in a return to work situation look at maybe public sector organisations, and they find themselves, if you go for the Chief State Solicitor's Office or something something like that, you're going to find yourself in a competency interview if you get called for interview. The application form itself is very much competency focused, and then the interview is focused. And what happens with a competency based interview is the employer identifies 4 or 5 abilities that they consider are absolutely vital for the job. And they also identify 1, 2, maybe 3, normally 2 motivations, so things like commitment to career or whatever. And they organise the application form often, but certainly the interview around these 7 things, the 4 to 5, normally 5 competencies and the 2 motivations. And they ask a very standard question. And the question is like the one on the screen now. Say they're asking about multitasking. The ability to multitask is an important competency in this job. Can you outline a situation when you were required to demonstrate an ability in multitasking? And when you answer that question, they'll then move on to something else like leadership, and they'll say, ask the same kind of question. The ability to provide leadership is an important competency in this job. Can you talk us through a time when you were required to demonstrate leadership? How do you answer that kind of a question? Well, firstly, what we'll do is we'll look at common mistakes that people make in competency-based interviews. They don't demonstrate stories that demonstrate the skills. So it's really important that you tell a story. They're looking for, if you see the way they ask the question, they look for examples. They say, can you tell us about a time? So they're not asking you to talk generally about whatever competency they're interested in. They're asking you to tell about a particular time when you demonstrated an ability within that with that regard. Using we rather than I is a mistake because the story is about you, and if you're saying, well, I was part of a team and we did the following, they don't quite know how much you did, and you're going to only get a share of possible marks if you talk a lot about we in your story rather than I. The story really should be about you and how you demonstrated whatever competency that they're looking for. Another problem people have is not providing enough detail, and where they tell a story, but there's not much in the way of a story. There's not much in the way of detail, and so it's really important that you tell a story that people can empathize with, and people, the interviewers enjoy. And of course, the very worst thing you can do is admitting that you've no competency within the area. So if they ask about leadership and you say, well, actually, I'm a lousy leader, you're not going to get any marks for that question. And the way a competency-based interview works is everybody on the other side of the table is marking you for every question out of say 10 or whatever, and if you don't give a good answer for a particular question, you're going to be in trouble, because other candidates are going to come in and they're going to score well on every single question that they're asked, and you need to do this. You need to have a good story ready. The recommended way to answer competency questions is using the STAR method. I've added an additional R to this. I think it fits in with the general interview strategy that I would propose, and that is always referring everything back to the job and the needs of the job that you're being interviewed for. But what you're being asked to tell a story, so the STAR method is to explain the situation, describe a task that maybe arose for you, that you found yourself faced with, the action you took, the result you got, and as I said, my second R is the relevance to the job. So you might say, if you're asked about leadership, you might say, well, leadership is important. It's always seems to have been, something that I've had quite an involvement in, both when I was studying and then when I started working, and through my jobs I've always been involved. But in terms of a specific example to talk about to you, I think an interesting one is what happened to me this summer. I'm involved as a scout leader, and we bring young scouts down to a camp every August, and we did this year. We brought them to Achill, and the weather forecast was fine, everything was meant to be fine, but this squall came in at about 2 o'clock in the morning. Wind and rain came in without any notice or without any warning, and tents got ripped up. People, the young kids were getting very frightened. They were running around trying to, catch the tents and various things like that. And there were cliffs nearby, and we were in a really dangerous situation. So that was the situation I was in. And I realised what I had to do was take control of the situation and make sure that everybody was safe. So I got the other scout leaders to call everybody in together. And the first thing I did was to do a name check to make sure that everyone was there, and to kind of lighten it up a little bit. We used nicknames and funny names for everybody, but we checked that everybody was there, and then we had to keep them together. We had to keep them busy. So I decided it would be a good idea to have a sing-song or a talent competition, and I described this great prize that was going to be on offer. And each of the scouts, either individually or sometimes in teams of 2 and 3, they all performed. They all did their piece, and they did it in the centre of the circle. So at all times, everybody stood around with linked arms, and I was able to make sure that nobody was going missing or anything else like that. And we continued this through the bad weather, and about 5 o'clock in the morning the sun started to rise, and as the sun started to rise, the storm passed on, and suddenly quite quickly it became that the rain stopped, the wind came down, and we were able to get the tents together. They were wet, and the sleeping bags were quite wet, but it was decided that everybody should go to bed, and we went to bed and slept till about 11 o'clock and got up, and we did a little bit the following day, but really it was time to go to return home. So we returned home, but the outcome of it, the result, was that everybody, all the kids, had a wonderful time. They went from a dangerous situation to a really good time, and I think and they went back and they talked to their parents about it, and they had a wonderful time. I think this is relevant for the job that we're talking about today, because there are times when the situation changes quite dramatically, and somebody needs to step up and take control. I think if somebody can't do that, they're not going to do this job particularly well. So that's how you talk through a competency question, and you'll do that 5, 6, 7, 8 times. You'll deal, as I said, with a number of competencies, normally 5, and then quite normally 2 motivations. So motivations might be things like commitment to career and that kind of stuff. And the question will be phrased in the same way, and the answer is best answered using the STAR, double R star approach. So, telephone interviews. We're going to now talk about telephone interviews. Telephone interviews come up for people in a return to work situation quite often, because quite often we would hope anyway that you are going to go out and make contact with employers and say, I got an interesting kind of option I'd like to talk to you about, and that, and you will find yourself in an interview, a telephone interview type situation. What we would say with regard to telephone interviews is, when you contact an employer in order to put a proposal to them, if you can, get in front of them. So seek a meeting. You've emailed them, you've followed up with a phone call, and you're looking for an interview. They will be tempted to say, well, tell me about it on, now here, tell me about it. And if you do, you're not going to get very far, because they'll say, well, I'll think about that and I'll come back to you, and it's not going to happen. What you want to do is organize a meeting, a physical meeting where you sit down with them and you talk, not for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, works so much better. So aim to hold out for a meeting anytime you can if you're in contact with an employer by telephone. If you, particularly where you make contact with them and you're seeking a meeting, hold out for the meeting. But there are other times where they may phone you and say, well, I'd like to, talk through, some kind of an idea, proposal, or maybe you've been recommended by somebody and they say, John Smith says you're available, can I ask you a few questions or whatever, and you are faced with a telephone interview. Some people feel, well, telephone interviews are great, I can do them from bed, by smoking a cigarette and, drinking a cup of coffee. And that really isn't the way. The problem with the telephone interview is all they've got to make a decision about you is your voice and the tone of your voice and how you handle your voice and how you handle the discussion. So it's really important that you do that well, that you make the very best. You put in a really solid performance. How do you do that? Well, the first way is to prepare. Think about the questions you're going to ask and write notes. And the great thing about a telephone interview is you can have the notes there in front of you. You can, lay out if strengths or whatever, you can lay out what your strengths are. We would recommend that when you actually take the phone call, stand, because whereas I'm sitting now, your voice sounds much better if you're standing up. Your lungs have greater capacity, and you sound more powerful, and you'll feel more powerful. So we would suggest you stand for when you're doing a telephone interview, and smile. Why would you smile when you're on a telephone? It doesn't matter. The reason you smile is your voice comes across that much more attractively on the other end. You can hear, strangely, you can hear a smile across a telephone line. So stand up and smile. When you're asked questions, it's a good idea on telephone interviews to repeat them, because you're maybe not absolutely sure, or maybe there's a half a word where you haven't quite heard. So repeat it back is a great thing. What you need to do with telephone interviews is generally is tighten up your answers and give short answers. It's said at a physical interview that an answer should be 2 minutes long, and both sides of the table should talk 50% of the time. Telephone interview, the interviewer should talk about 60, even 65% of the time. And you so don't have anywhere near as much time to talk. You've only got 35% of the time. And your answers should be short and tight, much more like sound bites, the way politicians and others talk on the radio. You think about beforehand what you want to say, and you try and distill it down to a short statement, and you, as you talk, you communicate in very short, tight statements, and you try and stay away from detailed explanations in as far as possible, and don't interrupt. Keep things simple. So that's how you should handle interviews. But as we said, there are times that you'll be asked, to go through a telephone interview. But if you are contacting an employer for a meeting, hold out for the meeting. Negotiation. We're going to look at negotiation now. When's the best time to talk money, to talk salary? After the employer has said they want to hire you. The problem is getting to that point, because what happens with an employer, of course, is they want to know where they stand about money normally at the first interview. Why? Because they don't want to go to the altar rail with you, on hoping that they can get you, in terms of that there's match with regard to money, and then find at the very last jump, that everything falls asunder. So the employer will generally be happy to get you to clarify the thing about money early on. The problem is that if you do that, you can leave yourself stranded. You can look for too much, you can look for too little. And quite often, we see it all the time, people look for too little, and that actually compromises them, and the employer loses interest. Well, they're only looking for 35,000, they clearly, or they mustn't be up to the kind of job that we're looking to fill here. So what you should be doing is, as you go into a selection process with an employer, is you should be seeking to find out the absolute max that they will pay. Why? Because that's what you should be aiming to get. If an employer wants to pay 70,000 a year, why should you go and work for them for 10,000 less? So aim to find out what they want to pay in any way you can. And there's a range of different ways of doing that. If you know people who work in the organisation, or you can meet up with people who work in the organisation through personal contacts you have, that's very good. Research the going rate. Sometimes people have, quite... have a concept about what a job is paying, which really isn't, based on reality. The recruitment firms publish pay scales, and quite often those pay scales, if you're talking about a position in general practice, they're just not relevant, and all they're going to do is upset you. So find out about the true going rate for the job that you're going forward for, and consider all benefits and factors. It's quite different if an employer is giving a pension and maybe permanent health insurance or something else like that. That's quite a different proposal than somebody who's just paying basic salary. And there might be flexibility in terms of working shorter hours or whatever. Sometimes that's almost has a monetary value. So find out everything that the employer is likely to be able to put on the table. What you should do, however, in terms of your own strategy, is avoid giving them a figure, particularly at first interview, and certainly never give them a minimum figure. And the minimum figure is used quite often by recruiters. They might say, well, okay, give us your absolute bottom figure or whatever. And once you give a recruiter or an interviewer a bottom figure, you're in trouble, because that becomes where they're going to pitch things at. So don't do that. So the classic thing to say is, well, I don't believe we're going to fall out over money. There's lots of variables at play with regard to remuneration, and what I'm really keen on is to get the right job, to get the right relationship, to find a firm where I can make a real contribution and develop over time. So I don't expect that we're going to fall out over money. However, if you are feel that you need to give them some kind of a figure, that you're being cornered or whatever, give them a range, give them a wide range. So give them a figure that extends both from your very bottom figure to a figure that's a good deal higher than you would expect to get. So if you're seeking 45,000 but you would work for 42, you might say, well, if I had to give a figure, I'd say somewhere between 42 to 52,000, and that gives them a nice wide band. They then know that if absolute bog standard, they might be able to get you at 42,000, but you've left things a good deal wider, and it works even better if you say, well, of course it depends on other benefits and whatever any other benefits that are would be on offer. But if you're looking for a figure, but you never give them a figure, give them a range, and that range of 10, 15,000 is absolutely, it's the way to go. Another good thing to do is throw it back at them, is to say, they say to you, what are you looking for salary wise? And you say, well, I don't expect that we're going to fall out over money. What's really important to me is the right job. I presume the salary on offer, though, has to fit into your existing structure. Does it? And they will say yes. And what you can then say is, well, do you mind, so you've got a figure in mind then, have you? Yes. Well, do you mind telling me what it is? And so you completely and utterly, turn the tables around, and that can work very well. It is, by the way, something that I would be, keen to see you do well at, because a solicitor, part of their job so often is to negotiate. So if you can't negotiate a good salary for yourself, it, I think, reflects on your candidacy. So it's important to negotiate well. We're now going to look at proposing an arrangement. What we're talking about here is we would, as part of the get back to work, return to work strategy, we have already recommended very strenuously that you look at approaching employers and speculatively approaching employers and saying, I've got a particular proposal here or something that might be of interest to you, and you might be going to them saying, I want to work part-time, or you might be going saying, I'd like to open up a family law the family law part of your business and develop it. It could be any kind of a proposal. And this happens a lot with people in a return to work situation, because quite often you're not going to be suited to that normal kind of grunt job, you could almost call it, where they're looking for somebody to get through lots and lots of conveyancing and to be there every morning at 8:30 in the morning and through to after 6. That's not the kind of job. So often what works really well for people in a return to work situation is where you're proposing some kind of an arrangement that they hadn't thought about before. So the first thing to do is make sure that whatever you're proposing, firstly, it needs to reflect and be all about what you're looking for. But as I've said before, you've got to have molded it and turned it into something that's an attractive proposition for the employer. Keep it simple. Don't get too involved with detail or whatever. They will ask you, no doubt about it, and you need to have things properly, have thought things out and be able to explain. But all the time try and keep it very simple and uncomplicated. If once you start getting complicated, you run the risk of losing the employer. They just say, well, there's too much involved here, whatever. Not a good idea, And if you know of places where it's working, if there's another firm down the road and they have that kind of arrangement, or of a firm that does this at a in a really committed way, maybe short time working or something else like that, you can point to another employer who's having great success as a result of the kind of arrangement you're talking about. It's really useful to point to that. The kind of arrangements we're talking here about so often would be where you want to work on a part-time basis, or some kind of flexibility. You maybe want to work from home some of the time, and that is really so possible now with developments in ICT. We don't need to be in the office 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. It might be sometimes we see people who have been so long out of work, 10 plus years out of work, that they feel that they need to get some work experience or something else like that. So you might be going to an employer and saying, I'm interested in getting back involved in work. So, could I join you on some kind of a casual basis, maybe 2 or 3 days a week? I'm not concerned or overly concerned about money. There's a range of different options in terms of saying to an employer, my priority at the moment is to get back in the swim of things. And you would be surprised if you do that, how quickly your confidence, firstly your ability in terms of to handle work, you get on top of things, and how quickly your confidence builds up, and how quickly you'll find that other employers are interested in you. So if you've been working for 2 or 3 months in Walsh and Co in Swords, and an opportunity comes up in Balbriggan, you're in there alongside people who have been working solidly for the last 5 or 6 years. So you don't need a lot of experience to re-establish yourself in employment. You might be going to them with a proposal about how you could bring in new business or increase business in an activity that they're involved in. You might be talking to them about an initiative that you know about and that you could action that would involve cost saving or revenue generating. So we're coming to the end of session 4, so that's where we're at the moment. And what we covered in session 4 was we looked at successful interviewing, we looked at competency interviews, we looked at telephone interviews. Both we covered these just to make sure that in case you find yourself up against them. We looked at negotiating, and we looked at proposing an arrangement to an employer. We have a little bit of homework, not too much here. I'm asking you to watch this video that's up on the screen, and also there's a website that you might be worth checking out, theworkingmother.ie.